and welcome to our last Linnean Lens of the year. So if you haven't been to a previous Linnean Lens, the concept of Linnean Lens is that we aim, it's a focus on one item in our collections, and we use an external camera to try and get you close to the material, as well as using PowerPoint, and this is to introduce you up close to an item of note in our collections. So previous Linnaeus Lens have included Anna Atkins' cyanotypes, Darwin's vasculum, some of Linnean manuscripts and specimens, and more, and they can all be found on our YouTube channel, and I'll put the link in a minute in the chat box. Before I introduce our two speakers, just a few words of housekeeping. You can use the chat for comments, but if you have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That's what I will be using to parse through questions when I read them to Liz and Janet towards the end of our session. So today we have two speakers who will speak in turns to introduce you to the botanical notebooks of Frank Nicholls. And this manuscript that is the subject of this Linnean Lens is within our manuscript sequence in our collection. It's manuscript 24, and I will put the link to the catalogue record in the chat as soon as I'm finished this introduction. To introduce our speakers, we have Liz McGow, who's been the Linnean Society archivist since 2016, and she has been cataloguing the Society rich archives collections and making them accessible to the public through our online archives catalogue. So Liz knows our archives collections very well. And then we also have conservator Janet Ashdown, who's been working at the Linnean Society for 22 years. And Frank Nicholls' manuscript was her final project for her conservation degree at Camberwell College of Art. So this is a manuscript that she knows very well, having worked on it. And before I pass on to Liz to start off, I just want to show you the setup a little bit. And this is with the purpose of pleading for your patience if we have any technological issues, because we're all in the same room. And I'm going to use the camera and there are Liz and Janet over there, each at their computer and with the manuscript in between them with the external camera. So we're dealing with a PowerPoint 3 or 4 computer cameras and the external camera. So I'm hoping that this will go without a hitch, but there's no reason why it shouldn't. So Liz, I'm going to put my video off and mute myself, and it's over to you.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. Hi, my name is Liz McGow. I'm the archivist here at the Linnean Society. Today we have chosen a manuscript from our archive to show you. It is an 18th century botanical notebook by the physician Frank Nicholls. As Isabel has said, we're doing things a little bit differently today because we have Janet and I both talking about this item. And that's because it's had a very turbulent history and was almost destroyed in the Second World War. So I'm going to start off by telling you about Frank Nicholls, who he was, what he did, etc. Then we're going to use the overhead camera to look at the manuscript itself, and I'll show you some examples. And then finally, I'll tell you about how the manuscript came to the Linnean Society and what happened to it when it was in the possession of our treasurer, Francis Druce. And then I'll hand over to Janet, who will tell you about the extensive conservation project that was required in order to save this precious manuscript. So, first hurdle, I'm going to get my slideshow up. So I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, has that worked? Okay. Yeah. Perfect. So we're going to start looking at Frank Nicholls. Nicholls was born in London in 1699, the second son of John Nicholls, a successful barrister from Cornwall. And here is a portrait of Nicholls from the National Portrait Gallery, thought to have been done by Thomas Hudson in around 1745 to 1748. So Nicholls would have been in his mid to late 40s here. He was educated at Westminster School before going on to study medicine at Exeter College, Oxford. He set up practice as a physician in Cornwall, where his family were from and they held property there. But after tiring of running a provincial practice, he returned to London and continued his work as a doctor. He also began giving lectures on anatomy and physiology, which were hugely popular. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1728, and sometime before 1732, he was also elected a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, where he also regularly gave lectures. In 1751, Nicholls wrote a very influential pamphlet called The Petition of the Unborn Babes to the Censors of the Royal College of Physicians, which was an attack on male midwives and their questionable practices at the time, which Nicholls argued was leading to an increase in the deaths of both mothers and babies. And Janet has literally just purchased this. I don't know how well you can see that in the camera. So if you want to come and see that, we have that here in our library as well. Let me just change the slide. Just a year later, just a year after writing this pamphlet, he, following the death of Sir Hans Sloane, Nicholls was appointed one of the royal physicians to George II, whose portrait you can see here. And Nicholls attended him until his death in 1760. There is a fascinating letter in the archives of the Royal Society from Nicholls to George Parker, the second Earl of Macclesfield, in which Nicholls gives an account of the King's death at Kensington Palace, as well as an extremely detailed post-mortem examination of the King's body. So I think that tells you just how senior a figure he was, that he was able to examine the King's body. And here we have the letters and the report from the Royal Society Archives. Thank you to them for sending me a copy. It is a very lengthy report, and I'll just pick out the section which refers to the discovery of the king, which is actually on the first page on the right. So it says, according to the report of the pages then in waiting, about 7 in the morning, Saturday, October the 25th, a noise was somewhere heard, and upon inquiry, His Majesty was found fallen on the ground, speechless and motionless, with a slight confused wound on his right temple. Mr. Andrews, at that time surgeon to the household, attempted to take away some blood, but in vain, as no signs of sense or motion were observed from the time of his fall. And as I say, he goes on to give a very, very detailed account of the post-mortem examination. He opens up the king's chest, his lungs, his brain. And the reason he gives such a detailed report is that he feels it is important to have a scientific record of what happened to the king. And I'll return to this letter later on, as it links really nicely with our manuscript. In his personal life, Nicholls was married to Elizabeth Mead, who was the daughter of Dr. Richard Mead, a Fellow of the Royal Society, and they had 5 children, although 2 of those died in childbirth. His son, John Nicholls, was a barrister and a member of Parliament for Bletchingley in Surrey, and later for Dragoney in Cornwall. And there are lots and lots of pictures of John Nicholls, including this brilliant one from the National Portrait Gallery, which I just had to include in the slideshow for that. Nichols's health was never very good, and he suffered attacks of fever and abscesses throughout his life. He died aged 79 on the 7th of January 1778, and incidentally this is just 3 days before the death of the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus, so their lives really were completely contemporary. Nicholls is buried in Goring-on-Thames in Oxfordshire, and he had bought an estate there in 1752, which is the same year that he started as the royal physician for the king. And funnily enough, Goring is actually the village that I grew up in. So it's only been researching this project that I came across this connection. And I fully intend to go and try and find his grave when I am next back that way. And I already know which house he lived in, as it's actually one that I have admired every time I walk down the old high street. It's one I've always had my eye on. So that's Frank Nicholls. I think we're going to next try and look at the manuscript in closer detail. If we could get that on screen, that would be great. I need to stop sharing, absolutely. And then, yep, okay, perfect. So, just bear with me. So we're going to start looking at the notebook itself. As I mentioned, there are 2 notebooks, but for ease, I'll just be looking at one today, as they're actually very similar in format. And I'll start with the manuscript on the camera, but I also have images on the slides as well to show you afterwards, because sometimes some of the detail is difficult to make out. So, and I'll flick a few pages so you can see as much as you can. The notebook consists of brief descriptions of British plants. They've been drawn up in a table format on each opening page, and the layout is very similar for each plant looked at. So you have a name, the description here, which often has things like the flowering periods, uses, appearance, but lots more detail, and I'll talk about that later on. And then almost every page is filled with these beautiful pen and ink drawings, which look as though they are just creeping across the page. It seems to be that sometimes the illustrations were drawn first and the notes added later on. As sometimes the descriptions are written around the stems, leaves and petals, with sometimes words even being split around the drawing. So you can see here that there's the drawing down here and the words have been written around it. And I have close-up examples of this later on. But then on other occasions, the text has clearly been done first and the illustrations done afterwards. As I say, I'll show you some close-ups on the slides. If I keep flicking, you can also see that there are blank sections. Oh, not on that page. Whoops. Or that page. Honest, yes, there we go. So there are blank sections on actually quite a few of the pages where just titles have been written in. And it seems to be that this suggests that it is a work in progress rather than a finished product, and perhaps the author wanted to return back to complete it when he came across the plants, hence he has left the space. From looking at the descriptions, it seems as though the author has been gathering information from a number of sources for the notebook, including contemporary publications such as John Gerard's Herbal, first published in 1597, as well as John Ray's Synopsis of British Plants, the third edition of which was published in 1724. Previous researchers working on this manuscript have spotted text copied almost verbatim from these publications, which the author must have had access to. And there are lovely references to Mr. Ray in the volume where Nicholls refers to his work directly. So I'm just going to go to, whoops, go to page 100. We have these numbers here, so that helps a good amount. But on page 100 here, in the top left corner, you can see this lovely daffodil. And then here it says, Mr. Ray says he has seen this in the fields at a distance from any house. And this must be referring to the English botanist John Ray, or it's very likely that it's referring to him. So to put that back in there. But in addition to using these sources, there are also copious notes made on the plants, which were clearly taken from observation in the field. And he does mention specific places that the plants were found, such as one flower being found on the walls of Nottingham Castle and another found in the corn near Devil's Ditch in Cambridgeshire. And there are references to localities, not lots, but on quite a few of the pages you can see these kind of written in. The drawings of the plants are all quite specific in style. I'll keep turning so you can see some more. And I haven't done extensive research on this, but I have not come across similar examples, which makes me think that they were his own work rather than being copied from elsewhere. And the descriptions are also really interesting and just really varied sometimes. So he mentions the appearance as well as uses, smell, flowering periods, etc. But interestingly, he talks about what happens to a plant when you do something to it. So if I find page 22. Yeah, this one here, the yellow rattle. He mentions that this makes a noise or rattling when it is shaken. And then the seeds of another plant, the treacle mustard pennycress, are sharp in taste, burning the tongue. So he really goes that extra mile to record as much as he can about individual plants. And the descriptions are just really chatty in style, which I think only adds to their charm. Hence, you have these references to Mr. Ray. So just to pull out a specific example of a whole entry, we'll turn to this one here, which is just in this top left corner, well, this whole section, but particularly this one, the bindweed. Now, this might seem like a slightly random example to pick out, but I love it because when I first came across this manuscript, when I started working here, I opened it on this page, And I joke you not, my husband and I were literally battling with this prolific plant back in our garden at home. And I didn't even have to read the title, look at the descriptions. I instantly recognized that it was this plant. And it just made me laugh thinking about people in history battling with this invasive weed. And it's really very recognizable from the description, which it mentions as well, which is just this top left here. It says, it hath long spreading branches, the leaves are smooth like ivy, but somewhat bigger, and being broken are full of milk, among which come forth great white and hollow flowers like bells. The seed is three-cornered, growing in small husks, covered with a thin skin, flowers from May till the end of August. And here again, you see mention of an action being done to the plant. He breaks the leaves. He isn't content with just observing. Now, I should point out that nowhere, in terms of authorship, nowhere in the notebook is Frank Nicholls' name actually written. And in the original cutting from the bookseller's catalogue that was still with the manuscript when it came with the society, which I'll hold up here, it's not the easiest. Oh, it's a bit kind of low. I have a close-up of this, so but in that cutting, there is no mention of an author. It just says it's 18th century manuscript in 2 volumes. So to identify the author, we had to turn to the numerous loose fragments which were found inserted in the manuscript. Amongst these was a bill in various parts. And Janet, would you mind just moving that out of the way for a second? Thank you. Addressed to a Dr. Nicholls. And I think it's hard to see again, but I have close-ups. But these are some of the inserts that we have, and what's lovely is you have this kind of jigsaw puzzle effect that we had great fun piecing together. And you can see that the bill is addressed to a Dr. Nicholls, or rather a Mr. Nicholls doctor. And it's lovely in itself because it refers to purchasing things like chamber pots. But what is really interesting is if you turn them over, you can see it has the exact same descriptions and botanical drawings as the rest of the notebook. This handwriting was then checked against records written by a Dr. Frank Nicholls and located in the archive at the Royal Society, including the letter I showed you earlier concerning the King's death. And these were found to be a match, so we can conclude that it was a Dr. Frank Nicholls who produced it. Similarly, we do not have a date on the volume itself, so we've had to use the date that was, I need to work on this. They can just make out 9th of January 1733 written there. So that's the date that we've had to base it on. This would mean that Nicholls would have been in his 30s when he was writing it and likely continued working on it for a number of years. So I'll move that there. Just whilst we're on the fragments, I'm just going to move this down. I'll just pull down the box and get that into shot. So this is the box which holds the manuscript, which was specially made for it. And as you can see, there are a huge number of fragments that were included, or were found rather, in the manuscript. And I should say that Janet painstakingly made a note of where all the fragments were found in the volumes for contextual purposes, and that's why you have these references which refer to the page numbers. So just a word on the fragments themselves. Now, the presence of such a huge number of loose inserts is very unusual for manuscripts. If you do have inserts, there would maybe be a handful, but not usually such a large number as this. Inserts can, of course, be very varied. When they appear in archive material, they may be in manuscripts quite incidentally, as in just tucked in, perhaps used as a bookmark, or for keeping an item safe, such as a photograph or a postcard, or they could relate to the volume itself. For example, we have some books and volumes which have letters which have been tucked in, or sometimes things like obituaries from newspapers relating to someone mentioned in the text. However, in this case, if we look at the many fragments in closer detail, many of them seem to be in the exact same format as the volume itself. So hence you have the descriptions and even these specially cut out illustrations. So it's thought that perhaps there was an earlier or even later version of the notebook which has been cut up to be able to compare, rearrange, or replace other plants, and hence you have this huge number of loose fragments. So I'll just move that back there. To finish this section, I'll just look at one more loose fragments, but this time a slightly unexpected one. It's only a fragment. Why can't I get this right? There we go. It's only a fragment, but we can read part of it. It says, "In vain, dear Chloe, you suggest that I, inconstant, have possessed or caught a fairer she." Interestingly, it is addressed to a Chloe rather than, if you remember me mentioning, his future wife, Elizabeth Mead, who we believe he married in the late 1730s or early 1740s. So this could possibly be a love note to an early lost love, or maybe an extramarital affair, or this is what I've been thinking all these years, and it was only last night that I did a bit of last-minute research, and I found that this text is actually part of an 18th century ballad, presumably reasonably well known, as I found a few references to it online. So poor Frank could have just been recording a poem that he liked, and I've just been reading into it for all these years. But again, this just shows you how much untapped information there is in these notebooks. So I'm going to try and return to the slides. So yeah, if we could return to the slides now, and I'll show you some of the close-ups. Share my screen. Oh yeah. Nope. I need it on the, yeah. I knew all that practicing wouldn't pay off. Perfect. Thank you. So now I'll just quickly show you some of the close-ups of the things I was trying to show you on the screen, but didn't really come across that clear. So that's an opening page which shows you the descriptions and illustrations in that table format. Here's an example of the illustrations being done first and the text being written around, so you can see the words being split up around some of the little stems. And this is the bindweed entry. So if you look at the top of the page, you can see that the text must have been written first and the illustration done afterwards, because the lower leaves have full detail on them, but the upper ones seem to just have the outlines so that you can see the text underneath. This is the bookseller's catalogue, which was when still with the manuscript when it came to the Linnean Society, referring to its origin. This is the receipt, which is where we have got that it is this Dr. Nicholls, and then we worked out that it was Frank Nicholls. And that's the reverse of that same fragment, which shows you the drawings and description. And then you can just at the top see the date, 1733. And that's part of the same bill. And this is what I thought was a love note, but is actually part of a ballad. And then before we go on to that, so that's the manuscript, and obviously it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour as there is a huge amount of detail in it. It was quite hard to actually pick out what to talk about because there's so much. And I should say that these are just my observations on this notebook. I am not a botanist. I do not have that background, unfortunately. And there is just still lots more work to be done on it. So some research questions that have come up just discussing with my colleagues when we were doing the research, what classification system has been used. It's quite confusing when you look at it as it is. Where have the illustrations come from? Did Nicholls do them himself, or has he copied them, or did somebody else perhaps do them? Can we find a more specific date than the 1733, perhaps using some of the locality references that are in there? Why are there so many fragments? Are they perhaps to fill the gaps on the pages or to replace descriptions where he has changed his mind? And why is the Dear Chloe text from the ballad in there? Did he send it to someone? Why is that in there? So if you think you can help us with these questions, please get in touch, as we would love to answer them. And it really is, it really does need exploring a huge amount more, this manuscript. And I'll just quickly finish on Francis Druce, who's this man here. So, and I'll tell you about what happened to the manuscript and how it came to be at the Linnean Society. So the manuscript was originally in the possession of a man called Francis Druce, a fellow of the Linnean Society and our honorary treasurer from 1931 to 1940. And this photograph is from our own archive collection. Fellows were often asked to provide photographs or portraits for our records, thankfully. Druce, a solicitor by profession, was a keen botanist and an even keener collector of books and manuscripts. He was known to always carry a notebook in his pocket, listing the editions he already had, and he would never miss an opportunity to visit a bookshop, however humble. He had started collecting botanical notebooks in 1913, and it was his intention to donate his botanical library to the Linnean Society. Sadly, this was not meant to be, as Druce's flat, very sadly, was bombed on the 16th of April 1941. That was in Cadogan Square, London, and it killed Druce and destroyed most of his possessions in the subsequent fire. According to the air raid fire reports from the London Metropolitan Archive, this date saw one of the heaviest raids on London during the Blitz, and the list of fatal casualties in the archive for Kensington and Chelsea lists Francis Druce, aged 68, as well as 3 others killed in flats in the same block. The event is referred to in Druce's obituary in the Society's proceedings. Unhappily, the catastrophe which cost him his life and deprived those who knew him of a trusted and valued friend involved also the destruction of the whole of his herbarium and the great majority of his books. His friend I.A. Williams rather sweetly says that Druce's spare, rather short figure will be greatly missed at the Society's meetings. However, some items were saved from the wreckage, although many of these were badly damaged, and this includes the botanical notebooks of Nicholls, but they were in a terrible state. They were donated to the Linnean Society in 1946 in accordance with Druce's will, which he had drawn up a few years before. And now I will hand over to Janet to tell you what happened next.
Hello, everybody. We have the second slide. Thank you. So in 1999, when I was doing my, sorry, technical problem. In 1999, when I was about to do my final project for my conservation degree course, the librarian Gina Douglas asked me if I'd like to have a go at these 2 manuscripts, and this is what I was presented with, a brown box with these rather damaged items inside. It all looked very exciting. So I was asked to look at the manuscript with a view to conserving and repairing it. The Society wanted to be able to open both the notebooks so that they could be studied. Both notebooks had been in this unusable condition since being given to the library just after World War II. I have no reason to believe that they were ever opened in the intervening years. Neither notebook could be opened without risk of further damage. The covers, a reused vellum document, had suffered heat and water damage. The skins, as you can see here, had distorted and contracted, and they dragged and tore the edges of the pages of the manuscript as they contracted. It then dried in this form and became too stiff to open. Next slide. Thank you. The first task would be to remove the vellum cover. The stab style sewing was still intact. The thread had not broken or burned, and it prevented the cover being slid off. The stitching had to be cut through, and the cover was very carefully pulled away from the text block. Got the next slide, please. As it came away, it was evident that there were many loose fragments of paper inside, together with a very few plant fragments. Some paper fragments seemed to be pieces torn from the edges of the pages by the action of the contracted cover, and others appeared to be small cuttings of paper and notes with drawings left loose between the pages. Next page. Thanks. Every page, as you can see from here, every page needed to be cleaned, flattened, and repaired. The loose pieces needed to be reattached if their original location could be discovered, or located within the pages where they were found. This was a logistical challenge. In the end, it was decided to number the loose fragments according to which volume and page they were found in. Being a manuscript, there were no obvious page numbers, so these were penciled in before the manuscript was taken apart. Each page was carefully stored in the correct order in separate numbered folders. and loose fragments were stored with their neighbouring pages. You can imagine I had a great number of folders by the time I'd pulled all these apart. Next. Oh, sorry, not the next one yet. The paper was very creased. It was dirty and fragile, especially along the torn edges. Cleaning can be a very rough process. So after gently removing some loose dirt with a smoke sponge, the pages were laid between sheets of polythene and washed. And this is done by placing the piece of paper on a piece of polythene, spraying it with deionized water, and then applying another polythene sheet on top, and then rubbing out the edges with a cloth. This squeezes out the water together with much of the dirt. It also helps to flatten the creases. Each page was then dried between weighted sheets of blotting paper. There was evidence of mold growth where the pages had been damp, but I didn't make any additional effort to remove these pink stains because I felt that the paper was weak enough already. And besides, it doesn't seem to have detracted from the text or the drawings. And it's also part of the provenance of the and the history of the manuscript. So the dried clean pages were then repaired, as you can see in the lower picture. Tears and very weak areas were repaired with fine Japanese tissue paper, and missing areas were infilled with a heavier Japanese paper. And unless a loose scrap could be matched and reattached, a few of those I did manage to relocate, some not. Pure wheat starch paste was used as an adhesive so that any repairs could be reversed if needed. It might be in the future that somebody either finds one of the missing fragments at the edge and wants to take off the repair and replace that. So this was repeated with every single page. Next slide, please. Right. The remaining loose fragments were also dealt with in this way. They were cleaned and they were repaired if necessary. I then numbered them and they were encapsulated. And the reason for doing that was to, one, protect them, and two, because small fragments will blow around and fall about very easily and they'll get lost. And I felt that this gave them more of a presence. Next slide, please. So here you can see the old cover that's been taken off. And you can also see on the right how a mock-up of how the thing was originally bound. So a decision had to be made as to how to rebind the notebooks. And usually if an original binding can't be reused, a new and similar binding is made. In this case, the original style of binding would have made fully opening the manuscript very difficult. I'll show you later with a mock-up, the mock-up that I did, just how difficult it is to open to a flat page. So, and the next slide, please. So it was decided to create a simple wraparound soft vellum cover, but it's been sewn through the spine with linen thread instead of down through the top and the bottom and the front and the back. And again, I can illustrate that in a minute. The loose fragments, some of which were cut to odd shapes, were encapsulated, as I've said, just to make them easier to handle. In the event that any of these fragments are found to be belong elsewhere in the manuscript, either stuck to the pages or as a part of a missing area, they can be taken out of the Melanex capsules and re-adhered. And finally, we made a box to house both the manuscripts and the fragments and the original covers. Very importantly, we never throw any of the original material away. The original sewing thread was also retained, and I also kept a sample of some of the dirt that I found in there, because in my experience, you can never tell what future researchers will ask to look at. And I'll be happy to take any questions afterwards. Thank you. Yes, so this is, oh, I can do that. So this is a stab style. That's the way that the manuscript would have originally been bound. And you can see it's called Japanese stab binding. It's quite a simple method of binding something. But you can see it's very difficult to open up. And although Frank Nicholls did leave a nice margin on the gutter edge, so that any binding would not necessarily obscure his work, it still would have made it very difficult for anybody to look at. So I felt that since we had to replace the binding, we might as well improve on it slightly and make it easier for people.
Janet, can I interrupt? Sorry, because I think on the manuscript you can actually see where the margins were. And do you want to point that out? There's a few. Oh, if you leave it in, if you leave it on,
okay,
because we can see it.
Sorry,
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, you can see where it was sewn, can't you?
Yes, you can see the little holes there, the original holes. Yes.
Yeah.
The other thing I thought you might like to see is the one of the original covers, which is, in fact, it looks to me as if it's a legal document of some kind. I did have a go at trying to decipher what was on there, but it's all a bit faded. I'm not exactly sure what kind of parchment that is. It could be sheepskin, it could be calf, it could be goat. I suspect it may be sheep. It's very thin.
Janet, could you hold it up a bit?
How's that? Okay.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
And the other thing I wanted to show you was, I mentioned earlier, a smoke sponge. It's a vulcanized rubber sponge that was developed to clean things that have got loads of soot on them when they're in fires. And these are they can be just dabbed onto things, and they're very, very efficient at getting surface dirt off without abrading the item underneath. And the other thing I'd like to show you, in case you're not familiar with it, Japanese tissue paper. This is a handmade one, probably about 5 GSM perhaps. It has very long fibers. When you tear it, you maybe just be able to see that if I put it against the cupboard. And so it's very good for sort of sticking on the edges of pages. It also doesn't seem to mind which direction you put it in. Very strong as well, very strong. And then for the missing areas, I used another Japanese paper, which is a thicker, again, a handmade one. And again, you can see it has very long fibers. So yes, that's why we use Japanese paper anyway, in case anyone was interested. I think that's, yes, I can show you. Yes, perhaps. So that shows you some of them. Can you see the sort of slight pinking there? That appears to be some kind of a mold that grew. Fortunately, it didn't eat into the paper, but it's obviously did get moldy. And also, perhaps I can show you, perhaps under there, it might be, can you see that's how I sewn it through the spine? That's what I meant. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Padma, I can't start my video because you've stopped it. Sorry, you're going to have to let me co-host again. Sorry. Thank you, Janet and Liz. That was absolutely brilliant and really nice to learn more about this quite special manuscript that we have in our collections. So there's a few questions in the Q&A. Before I get to them, there was also a comment in the chat about the fact that you were not using gloves, Liz. So just in case anyone is wondering, we rarely use, sorry, go ahead, Liz.
Oh.
All right, okay. We rarely use gloves in archives because, well, archivists do not use gloves anymore when they're dealing with books or paper or manuscript because you run the risk of tearing the paper. You've got much less sensitivity in your fingers, and so the risk of tearing the pages is much greater. So we now simply clean our hands and deal with clean hands. Any manuscript that we touch, we have clean hands. Obviously, if we're dealing with a work of art or an object, that's slightly different. And Janet, within that same inquiry, was what kind of paper is used in the manuscript? Can I leave that one with you on mute and you on mute so that we don't?
Hi. It looks to me as if it's a fairly typical 18th century handmade paper, cotton rag probably. It's quite a fine paper, not very thick. I don't believe that I saw any watermarks on it, so yeah, but it would be a paper typical of that period, well before machine-made papers.
While you're there, I'm going to ask you also how long it took you to restore the manuscript is one of the questions.
Forever and a day. I worked on the first volume, the larger one, for most of. I completed that within my project time, but that took about 6 months, and then I joined the society, and because I had to get the second one repaired, so they had to invite me in to do that. Yeah, and the second one probably took me overall about 6 months. You know, you have to wait for things to dry so you get on with other stuff in the meantime, but it was quite lengthy, and you can see that the repairs around the edges of the pages were quite complex in some. Let me just see if I could find some, especially at the beginning. I mean, that takes a long time to do, and you have to sort of, you use a sheet of this clear polyester, and then you trace the contour around, and then what you do is you pinprick through where you've traced onto a piece of Japanese paper, then you wet it, then you tear it, and you should, if you're lucky, get the exact contour. That kind of thing takes a long, long time. So
there's another conservation related question. What was the thickness of the Japanese tissue paper?
I think that the tissue is probably about a 5 GSM. I'm just guessing. They vary so much, and actually the GSM doesn't always give you a good indication of how thick it appears to be. The other one is probably something around the heavier paper. I'm guessing that one's probably around sort of 14, 15, something like that.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go through now questions that are related to Frank or Nicholls himself. So that's probably more for you, Liz. The first one is, was he baptized Francis? Caroline Murray says, I had thought that Frank for Francis was a relatively late contraction abbreviation.
If I'm honest, I don't know. The only reference I've found so far, obviously on the manuscript is, or in the fragment, is Frank Nicholls. When I've been researching him, I don't particularly remember coming across him as Francis, but I'd have to check. Obviously, because of Francis Druce and Frank Nicholls, it may be that I am just confusing the two. I had to stop saying one name as opposed to the other, but I'm not sure. I can double check when I do some more research and let you know.
Or of course, anyone is welcome to come and do some research. The other question regarding him, was Nicholls a gardener? How did he acquire the plants he illustrated?
Again, another fantastic question. That wasn't how I assumed he had come across these plants. The locality references tend to be more out and about, so I'd assumed he kind of went searching for them rather than necessarily in his own garden, but I'm sure there are a mixture of plants which he did find in his own garden as well. But I think on the whole they tended to be maybe botanical exploration he was doing. That's my understanding of it.
I think there's another question that is interesting, but I don't think we're going to be able to answer. Loretta says, this may seem trivial, but do you know if Nicholls was left-handed? I think that's probably the direction of the plant, of the drawing.
Oh, I have absolutely no idea, but that would be a really interesting thing to look into. But yeah, that could be the slanting. I'm not sure. That kind of thing doesn't tend to be recorded in the things I've looked at. But another great question. I cannot answer very well, I'm afraid.
There's a few questions and comments about the illustration themselves now, and then there's some on the fragments. I'm going to try and take them all together. Henrietta, hello Henrietta, says, this is the first time I've ever come across illustration drawn horizontally across the page rather than in upright form. And she's wondering if someone else knows of a published manuscript or a published book or manuscript precedent for this. Someone else says, do you find it is unusual that Nicholls' drawings were all done on the horizontal and not vertically? Any ideas about this, please?
Well, this is the thing, and because I was very conscious that I didn't want to be saying that these illustrations were his own, and then somebody would point out that they actually, well, of course, they're from this source here. But, you know, as people pointed out, it does seem very unusual. It does seem very unique that they are horizontal. And as I say, kind of creeping across the page, that does seem to be a style that he is going for. But no, I haven't found another source for it. And I couldn't help but thinking back to the previous Linnean lens that our librarian Will did on Richard Dryer's illustrated Britannica English botany of James Edward Smith, where he had noticed that the illustrations were done of the plants being described in the printed text in the margins, but he found that they were copied from, or most of them copied from other sources, including Sowerby, wasn't it? James Sowerby. But again, they were upright and fitted around the text. But this one is much more. The word I just want to say is creeping. They're much more taking over the page, and as I say, done before and done afterwards. So it's I kind of want to say an organic process, which no pun intended. But anyway, that's all I can. Again, love to find out more, because they are really, really unusual.
There's a few comments and questions about the fragments. Martin Nicholls says, might these fragments have been used as index cards? And Jem Toes Crichton says, the fragments are interesting, especially the way they have been cut up. Are there theories about why they have been cut into these shapes?
So again, are we on the first volume or the second volume? I think this first. So in some of the volumes, and I'll try and find the example, there are parts of the text which have been pasted over. So there aren't that many. Aha. So hopefully you can see this. You can see my pasted in bit in case this question came up. But you can see, if I very gently, you can see underneath he has changed his mind and pasted a bit of paper over the top. And we assume that this is what the fragments are for, that perhaps, as I say, he had another notebook in the same format and he has cut them up to use them in this notebook or the second notebook. Yeah, if you want to perhaps as Janet is showing you, to add in the drawings as and when. But this is the thing, because there are so many fragments, there are so many entries, it would be a mammoth task to try and check whether the illustrations we have in the fragments match up to some of the ones in the notebooks. A mammoth task, but a very important task that we would love someone to do. But that's our main theory on why we have such a large number of fragments, that they are part of the project that he was keeping to move around or compare or replace.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. There's a few questions about location and classification. So one of them, given that Nicholls was he was a contemporary of Carl Linnaeus, is there any evidence of him being aware of Linnaeus's plant classification system? And Liz and I were talking about this yesterday.
Oh, God. Okay. Yeah. So as I say, my background is not in botany, so I do not know very much about the classification system. Isabel and I had a quick look through some of the names, and there were some binomial names in there, or yeah, some that could definitely be recognized as that. So it seems as though he was certainly aware of Linnaeus. He has used some of these names, but then in most of the other examples, he is using longer descriptions, less familiar ones. We haven't found an obvious classification system. As I say, previous research done on it, they think that it was based loosely on John Ray's classification. But again, I haven't double checked this, and if I'm honest, I wouldn't know where to start how to do that. So it seems to be a bit of a mishmash. And again, he may have changed it as he was doing one notebook to the other. So again, not to keep saying it, but further research required if there are any takers out there.
Thank you. The questions keep coming in. I don't know how we're going to end up on time. So there's a few questions about locations and red data species conservation today. Gina Rowe asked, have the locations been recorded into Flora of Counties as historical record reference for those plants? And no, we haven't done that. But there are several comments saying, could the document be used to answer questions of conservation interest, for example, around the distribution changes for red data species? And then one following comment saying, sadly, one of the plants you showed, purple sea spurge, is now extinct in the UK, last seen in 1976. So I think that would be really interesting to do. But Liz, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I fully agree. I mean, from an archivist point of view, it would be wonderful as a basic level of cataloguing for this to have at least the names of the plants recorded, and obviously there's a complication in that if there are different types of names, but as well as details like locality references, so that we could do a much quicker search. But no, that would be fantastic to look at the wider uses for these. Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for letting us know about the extinct one. How sad.
There's going back to the drawings and the fact that they're horizontal. Elizabeth, hello Elizabeth, says maybe he drew them vertically and then turned the page to right. And then someone, Robin Walls, also adds, if I was drawing this, I'd turn the book around so that they were upright. And this allows the illustration to be a reasonable size and still fit within the box, most suited to the text. So interesting 2 comments. Thank you. Oh, there's just so many. There's a couple of comments as well. The ODNB says Nicholls, Francis, and then in parentheses, Frank. And then Royal College of Physicians have an interesting obituary for him, and they refer to him as Frank. So that was on the sorry, that was on the earlier question of Frank versus Francis. Janet, there's another one for you on conservation. Christine is interested in the cleaning and would like to know, what type water did you spray on the manuscript to clean any other solution?
I use deionized water. Tap water in this part of the country is generally not too bad for cleaning things because it's slightly alkaline because of the chalk. In other parts of the country, it's slightly acidic, so people tend to go for deionized water. But the other reason I used deionized water was that tap water will clog up the very fine mechanism on the sprayer that I use, and the sprayer is quite expensive. So yeah, so it had practical reasons for but yeah, but tap water is actually, if you live in the southeast, is not too bad to use if you want to wash things with that. But if you're using a fine sprayer that's just cost you £200, I suggest you use deionized water.
Thank you, Janet. 3 more questions left. So Liz, you mentioned that Nicholls was married to Elizabeth Mead, who was the daughter of Dr. Richard Mead, who was also a prominent physician. He was also a famous collector. Any evidence of this connection in the notebook?
As in the father of Elizabeth Mead was a prominent collector?
No, and yes, I guess so. I think it's about the connection between Nicholls and his father-in-law, basically.
All I know is that his father-in-law helped, I think, launch his career quite a bit. I think that's why he perhaps ended up coming to the attention of the court and being made the royal physician. I don't know much more about the father-in-law at all, I'm afraid. Again, this sounds like another avenue of research, but I'm afraid I can't answer it, but that would be really interesting to look into more.
There's another interesting, this is full of interesting questions, actually. Do you think this manuscript was intended ultimately for publication or just private study?
I've tried to think a lot about this. My gut instinct is that it was just for his own enjoyment, I think, because of the style of it, because of the slightly impractical manner with all the loose fragments and things, and because of these informal ways that he describes, like saying Mr. Ray. I think there's some little references that only he would know. I think it would make it very difficult to publish. So I say my gut instinct is that it was something he was doing for himself, and most likely to help him in his career as a doctor. He probably wanted to know what plants would be useful in his medical career. That would be my instinct.
Thank you. We've reached the last question. Dominique Delattre asks, have you searched or found evidence of contact connections with botanists from other countries? And he says, thank you for the quality of your presentation.
The short answer would be no. I have.
It's just Ray, isn't it, that he quotes?
That's the only reference I've found so far. As I say, previous researchers have mentioned Gerard's herbal, but yeah, I don't know about other sources. I mean, you can see how lengthy the descriptions are. So I'm sure even just looking at a few pages, you might be able to spot a few more. I'm sure he was using more than that.
Sorry, there's just two more. Well, one of them is saying fascinating, thank you. Oh no, they keep coming. Oh no, thank you, Henrietta, great presentation. But Robin Walls asked a really good question, actually. Did Nicholls have an index? If he was using it as an aide-memoire, he would have had to find things really quickly.
Yeah, no, there's, as Janet is shaking her head as well, there's nothing that's been found to indicate that. I imagine if we could find out a little bit more about the classification system, we might be able to help for how we would locate. Once one of the questions I was slightly dreading was someone might ask me to show me an example of a particular plant, which I just can't do at the moment because I don't know how it's arranged. So I would imagine that there probably was an index at some point, but it hasn't survived with this. And we believe that there maybe were more than 2 notebooks, because the first notebook that we looked at seems to come in halfway through a classification system that has, whatever that system is, that has been used. So no, there's no index at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liz and Janet. That was brilliant. That was really, really fascinating, and I learned lots. So I'm delighted. Thank you. That was amazing. And just to finish with another advertisement for our Book of Treasure, where you'll find Frank Nicholls in under the wrong date of 1773. I have to confess, it should be 1733, but you know, he died in 1778, didn't he? So 1773 is still encompassed within his lifetime. But if you're interested, the link is in the chat, and it's available from our website. And I see there's 3 more questions that have to come in, but just saying amazing, brilliant, and thank you. It hasn't been scanned, I have to say. Gina Rose asking. That would be quite a project. I know Andrea, our digitization digital assets manager, is online there. She's in the audience, and she probably shudders at the idea of having to scan all these fragments, but it would be lovely to have it online. It's true. But so if anyone has been inspired to come to the library and do some more research on Frank Nicholls, I think we would very much welcome that. Thank you everyone for joining. Our next Linnean Lens will be, if I remember well, on the 10th of January with Sandy Knapp from the Natural History Museum, who will be presenting on Alfred Russel Wallace's, I'm just trying, we've got 2 Linnean Lens on Wallace next year. Yeah, his manuscript on the palms of the Amazon. And yes, because of next year being the bicentenary of Wallace's birth, we'll have the next 2 Linnean Lens on our Wallace manuscripts. So please join us for this, and everything will be online under our events page. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to Liz and Janet again for a brilliant presentation, and see you soon. Bye.